Although the war had been over for more than 10 years, I was still troubled by frequent nightmares. They all took the same form. I was still there in the trenches with a few men. We knew the armistice had been signed, but we had been forgotten. So had a section of the Germans opposite. It was as though we were both doomed to fight on till extinction. From the autobiography I Remember by Arthur Bliss. The men and women who served during World War I were exposed to a type of military conflict that was fundamentally new. Recent developments in manufacturing and technology had yielded methods of destruction whose force and scope far surpassed anything previously seen. The use of tanks, aircraft, flamethrowers, poison gas, and exponentially more lethal artillery, bombs, and mortars turned thousands of square miles of European countryside into killing fields that saw tens of millions of military and civilian casualties. Even those who emerged from the conflict intact found themselves changed. If the war had begun during the summer of 1914 in an atmosphere defined by nationalist enthusiasms, by the time an armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, in a railway car about 40 miles north of Paris in the forest of Compiègne, many who'd served were left with a sense that the entire enterprise had been essentially futile. The struggle had economically exhausted both the victors and the vanquished, and while the Treaty of Versailles finalized Germany's de facto surrender and the terms upon which it was based, the accord wouldn't, and likely couldn't, effectively address many of the fundamental issues of nationalism and self-determination that had plunged so much of the world into catastrophe. By mid-October of 1914, Ralph Vaughan Williams was a 42-year-old married man from an upper-class family who, after a long apprenticeship, had firmly established himself as a composer with a pair of successful symphonies, an opera, incidental music for plays, and a wide variety of instrumental and choral ensemble music. Although he was well past the age at which he could be exempted from military service, his characteristic sense of social responsibility compelled him to serve in any way he could. Enlisting as a private in the Royal Army Medical Corps, he became an ambulance driver and stretcher bearer. As a medical orderly, he was tasked with the rescue of wounded and dying soldiers on the battlefield, often while the area was under heavy bombardment. Nighttime operations were particularly difficult. In many instances, the most reliable means of navigation was the illumination provided by explosions and the screams of the grievously injured. In 1917, the 45-year-old composer was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Royal Garrison Artillery, where he was constantly exposed to the sounds of heavy shell fire, an experience that's believed to have caused the deafness that afflicted him late in life. Although Vaughan Williams faced the ordeal of war with stoicism, his exposure to such ruthless, nihilistic inhumanity affected him deeply. In the words of his second wife Ursula, it gave Ralph a vivid awareness of how men died. And yet the direct effects of this experience on his music can be difficult to trace. Vaughan Williams was one of the 20th century's greatest musical poets, but he was reluctant to ascribe extra musical ideas to his abstract instrumental works. And his essential humility made the sort of self-revealing musical expressionism of composers such as Mahler and Berg a creative impossibility. His most unambiguous meditation on the tragedy of war is his Dona Nobis Pacem, a cantata for chorus, large orchestra, and two vocal soloists completed in 1936 and based on texts from the Roman Catholic Mass, the Bible, an anti-war speech by the 19th century liberal politician John Bright, and 3 poems by Walt Whitman. This work, written as Europe was sliding once again towards catastrophe, is clearly tied to Vaughan Williams' experience of the Great War. Music he'd written during the conflict's first year is included in the cantata, and his choice of poems written by Whitman during the American Civil War reflects both his long-standing affection for the poet and the particular bond he felt with a creative artist who also tended to the suffering on the battlefield. Nonetheless, the perspective-altering impact of Vaughan Williams' wartime service most often manifests itself indirectly. In 1938, the year before Britain's entrance into World War II, he began composing his Fifth Symphony, planning to base the work on music he'd been writing over the previous 3.5 decades for a still unfinished operatic setting of John Bunyan's beloved 17th century religious allegory, The Pilgrim's Progress. One evening, while talking with Ursula about his Pastoral Symphony, a piece written in the wake of the Great War that's filled with evocations of the English countryside similar to those in his Fifth, he spoke revealingly about how his experience of war had prompted and deepened his musical imagination. It's really wartime music, a great deal of it incubated when I used to go up night after night with the ambulance wagon. We went up a steep hill, and there was this wonderful Corot-like landscape in the sunset. It's not really lambkins frisking at all, as most people take for granted. Vaughan Williams dedicated his Fifth Symphony to Sibelius, a tribute arising from his use of the Finnish master's Beethoven-inherited technique of utilizing small motivic cells to craft large musical tapestries. Premiered in 1943, much of the thematic material in this formally concise four-movement work is derived from two intervals heard at the outset, a perfect fourth and a major second. Although the score calls for an orchestra of modest size, the sumptuous sonic textures that make Vaughan Williams' music so distinctive are present throughout, a reflection of his passion for Elizabethan polyphony and the grand English choral tradition. The symphony's dramatic narrative is exquisitely wrought, beginning with a prelude that's framed by the indefinite tonality of its quiet opening. It's followed by a stealthy scherzo, a romanza that's alternately haunting and searing, and then closes with a modified passacaglia, a Baroque form in which a bass-line-like melody that can appear in any voice is used as the basis for multiple variations. This finale, and indeed the entire symphony, reaches its ultimate climax with the return of the work's ambivalently harmonized opening bars, now in a full-throated orchestral fortissimo that gradually finds its way towards resolution, the fervor yielding as the harmonies finally coalesce around the symphony's home key of D major, closing the symphony in an atmosphere of sunlit serenity. Although we tend to associate the idea of a war symphony with the musical rhetoric of struggle and epic conflict that is so abundant in works such as Shostakovich's Seventh and Nielsen's Fourth, the path Vaughan Williams chose to follow in his Fifth Symphony reflects a different perspective. He and many of his compatriots saw the fascist threat as an assault on everything they cherished about their country, its way of life, its institutions, its traditions, and the land itself. Thus, Vaughan Williams' Fifth appears as a deeply vibrant meditation upon those qualities of being English he held most dear, a musical expression of the sentiment Shakespeare captured so memorably in Richard II. This throne of kings, this sceptred isle, this earth of majesty, this seat of Mars, this other Eden, demi-paradise, this fortress built by nature for herself against infection and the hand of war, this happy breed of men, this little world, this precious stone set in the silver sea which serves it in the office of a wall or as a moat defensive to a house against the envy of less happier lands, this blessed plot, this earth, this realm, this England.